My name is Emily Carter. I'm 35 now. I was born to two people the world adored, but who made me feel like I should never have existed. My father broke my jaw the night I told him I wanted to write. My mother. She laughed, said I finally looked better with my mouth shut. That night I bled, but I smiled because something broke open inside me too. If you think this is another sad story of abuse, wait. This is the story of how I buried my past in public, one twist at a time, and they never saw it coming. When I was 16, our house in Atlanta was always spotless, like something out of a Southern Living magazine. White columns, manicured lawn, fresh hydrangeas blooming along the walkway. My father, Charles Carter, was a high-profile attorney with a perfect win record and a portfolio filled with clients who shook the state's political foundations. My mother, Lorraine, once graced fashion campaigns in the nines before she transitioned into the full-time role of perfect wife. Together, they looked like the American dream, beautiful, successful, admired. I, on the other hand, was the smudge on their polished portrait. At school, I was quiet, reserved. At home, I was barely acknowledged unless I was being corrected. My voice always seemed to disrupt something. My father's concentration, my mother's rehearsed smile, or the quiet perfection of the dinner table. But on the surface, everything shimmered. One Friday in May, the house was transformed for my father's 50th birthday. Florists arrived before sunrise. Silverware was polished so fiercely I could see the reflection of someone I didn't recognize. The guest list included state judges, CEOs, and high society wives with pearls thick enough to choke on. There was no mention of my involvement in the event. No request to help, no task assigned, no dress selected. I wasn't asked if I'd like to say anything, sing, toast, or even smile. I was told to quite stay presentable and stay out of the way. That was my assigned role, a backdrop to his celebration. As the party began, I stood near the staircase, watching Lorraine glide from one guest to another, like she was still walking a runway. Charles shook hands, slapped backs, accepted compliments like he expected them. People whispered how proud they must be of me, how lovely I looked, how bright my future surely was. No one noticed how I winced when someone said, "just like her mother." No one noticed that I hadn't been spoken to by either parent all evening. The moment that carved itself into my memory came when the cake rolled out, a 5-tier monstrosity with gold lettering to Charles, our champion. There were speeches, 3 of them, one by his junior partner, one by a local judge, one by Lorraine, her voice flawless, her eyes glistening just enough to look real. Not once did anyone ask if I had anything to say. Not once did my father even glance my way. I clapped when everyone clapped. I smiled when the cameras panned across the room. I stood there in my borrowed dress, one Lorraine had picked out, not because it suited me, but because it photographed well. The ballroom echoed with laughter. Music floated like a lie, and somewhere between the second toast and the applause, I felt a sharp, unmistakable clarity. They didn't forget me. They never considered me to begin with. I wasn't the daughter in this story. I was the silent proof of perfection, a living prop in a portrait they were selling to the world. That night, after the last guest left and the caterers packed up, I lingered in the hallway. Lorraine passed by me without a word, her heels echoing like punctuation marks. My father walked into his study, still laughing at a joke someone had told hours earlier. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase. There were no bruises, no yelling, no slaps, and yet I felt smaller than I ever had. It was the quiet erasure that left the deepest mark. It was the first time I truly understood. You don't have to be beaten to be broken. Sometimes being invisible is enough to shatter you. When I was 6, I drew a picture of our family at school. We were standing in front of our house. Dad in a blue suit, Mum in a red dress, and me in between, holding both their hands. I coloured the lawn green, gave us bright yellow smiles, even added a son wearing sunglasses in the top corner. I thought it was perfect. That night, I brought it home, beaming. I waited until dinner was over, then slid the picture across the table towards my mother like it was a prized offering. She looked at it for less than 3 seconds. "Emily," she said sharply, "do my hips really look like that?" I blinked. She laughed, but it wasn't real. "And why is my lipstick crooked? You've made me look like a clown." Before I could respond, she picked up the drawing, folded it twice, and tossed it into the kitchen trash can behind her. "We don't put ugly things on display," she said, rinsing her wineglass. I didn't cry until I was alone. The next day, I dug the picture out of the trash, flattened it under my mattress, and never drew our family again. Years later, when I was around 10, something rare happened. My parents announced that we were going to the beach. No speeches, no warning, just packed bags and a road trip to Thai Island. I remember thinking maybe things were changing. The first morning there, my father helped me build a sandcastle with a moat. My mother laughed when a wave soaked her feet. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for the tension to snap back into place, but it never did. For those 2 days, they felt almost human. On the third day, a photographer showed up. He wasn't subtle. Full camera setup, reflector boards, and a clipboard with shot lists. My mother slipped into a white sundress. My father changed into khakis and a pastel shirt. They guided me to the beach, told me to hold a CL to my ear, and look enchanted. I remember thinking that word felt strange on my tongue. We posed, we smiled. The photographer gave thumbs up. My parents laughed and kissed at sunset, and I stood between them, arms wrapped around their waists. That photo was printed in a community magazine the following month, under the headline, "The Carters, Atlanta's Golden Family." It took me 6 more years to understand the trip had never been spontaneous. It was scheduled by my father's PR team after a legal win. The photographer was hired in advance. The smiles had been rehearsed, even the sandcastle. He had asked the front desk for a shovel set that morning. Everything I thought was real had been scripted. That revelation broke something in me. It wasn't just the lie, it was the memory itself collapsing. That was the only trip I had ever told people about with pride, the only story I thought made us feel normal, and now even that belonged to their illusion. The worst part, I still kept the shell. It sat in my drawer, clean and pink, smelling faintly of sunscreen and betrayal. It reminded me that even in the performance, I had felt warmth. And part of me hated how much I missed that feeling, even if it had been fake. Sometimes the things that hurt the most aren't fists or screams. They're the moments you once thought were love, only to discover later they were just lighting, camera angles, and an audience you never agreed to perform for. It happened on a Thursday. I'd just come home from school clutching a report card that wasn't perfect. My GPA was still high, top 5 in my class, but biology had slipped to a B+. Mrs. Henley was a notoriously tough grader, and honestly, I was proud of myself for holding my own. But I knew even before I walked through the front door that it wouldn't be enough. My father was already home. That was rare. He usually arrived after 7, bourbon in hand, tie loosened just enough to imply exhaustion, but never disorder. But that day, he stood in the kitchen in his shirt sleeves, hands braced on the marble counter. The moment I walked in, he turned towards me like he had been waiting. "Report card?" he asked, his voice flat. I handed it over with trembling fingers. He read it slowly, line by line. Then he looked up, eyes sharp. "What is this?" He tapped the B+ like it was a stain on his reputation. "I tried," I whispered. Everyone struggled in her class. His hand moved faster than I could see. The slap was open-palmed, loud, and so sudden that my brain didn't register the pain right away. My head jerked to the side, my ear ringing. I stumbled backward into the counter. He didn't yell. He just handed the paper back to me like he was passing off a receipt. "You represent this family," he said quietly. "We don't do mediocrity." Then he walked out of the room. I stood there frozen. My cheek was hot and swelling. But what I felt most was confusion. It wasn't about the grade. I saw it now. He'd lost a high-profile case earlier that week. The news had whispered about it. Maybe someone at school had mentioned it too loudly. Maybe he needed someone weaker than him to punish, and I was always conveniently available. Lorraine walked in a few minutes later, high heels clicking against tile. She glanced at me, at my blotchy face and red cheek, then to the paper still shaking in my hands. B+, she said, tilting her head. Really? I waited for anger, disappointment, or maybe, just maybe, concern. Instead, she opened her clutch and pulled out a slim gold lipstick tube. Try this one, she said, holding it out like a peace offering. It's a softer red. Will draw attention away from your cheek. I didn't take it. She set it on the counter and left the room, humming as she went. That night I stared at the mirror in my bathroom. The side of my face was bruised and puffy. I dabbed concealer over it, then added the lipstick. Curious. It was beautiful, creamy, soft, subtle. I looked like someone who had everything together, someone polished, and I hated it. That was the moment I realized what they wanted from me. Not perfection, but performance. Not truth, but appearance. I wasn't their daughter. I was their reflection. Any flaw on me made them look flawed too. The bruise faded within days. The understanding never did. 3 nights after the slap, I was standing behind a podium in our formal dining room, dressed in pale blue silk, smiling through a cheek that still ached if I touched it wrong. My father was throwing a fundraiser dinner for a senator friend. The house was glittering, guests were glowing, and Lorraine had hired a string quartet to perform softly near the French doors. Everything was curated down to the brand of bottled water served. Nothing was ever left to chance. Emily will say a few words, my father announced as dessert was being cleared. It wasn't a request. He had handed me the speech earlier that afternoon, typed double-spaced with margin notes in his handwriting. Gratitude, he had written at the top. Mention opportunity, values, strong family foundation. I hadn't eaten since lunch. My stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with dread. As I stepped up to the microphone, I caught sight of myself reflected in the glass cabinet behind the table. The lighting was warm, flattering, my makeup was flawless. You couldn't see the faint yellowing bruise beneath the concealer. You couldn't see how I had flinched when he handed me the paper, or how I had hesitated for a second too long before nodding. I began to read. I'm honored to say a few words tonight about the 2 people who shaped me into who I am. My voice didn't shake. It never did, not when it mattered. I had trained myself in that. I spoke about discipline, about structure, about expectations, framing them all as blessings. I smiled when I mentioned how much I had learned. At home, I even made a soft joke about my father being a little intense about grades, and everyone laughed except me. Inside I was screaming. I wanted to tear the paper in half. I wanted to shout, "He hit me 3 days ago. I haven't been able to sleep because I'm afraid I'll breathe wrong," and set him off again. I wanted to look each guest in the eye and ask if they'd still toast him, if they knew what his strong family values really meant. But instead, I read on. Publicly, I was graceful, eloquent, grateful. Privately, I was unraveling. As I closed the speech, I recited the last line, word for word. I'm thankful every day to be raised in a home where love, respect, and ambition walk hand in hand. Applause thundered. Lorraine dabbed her eyes with a cloth napkin, dabbing a tear I was sure didn't exist. My father stood beside me, one hand gripping my shoulder, with just enough pressure to remind me who had written the script. That night, after everyone left and the help was gone, I returned to my room and stood in front of my mirror again. I looked like the daughter anyone would want, poised, polite, successful, and I hated her. She wasn't me. She was the girl they had built like a monument, polished on the outside, hollow in the core, the real me. She was locked somewhere deep behind that smile, behind the lipstick, behind the words that weren't mine. Being beaten had hurt, but being forced to lie about it to a room full of admirers, that was the deeper violence. My first real act of rebellion wasn't loud. It was a spiral notebook I stole from the school supply closet. It had a bent corner, 2 missing pages at the front, and a navy blue cover with "Property of Midtown High" stamped faintly in gold. I kept it hidden under a loose floorboard beneath my bed, alongside a flashlight, a ballpoint pen, and a tiny tube of superglue to seal it shut after each use. That notebook became my diary, my confession booth, my only safe space. Each night when the house was silent, I'd slide it out, turn on the flashlight, and spill every truth I couldn't say aloud. I wrote about the slap, about the lipstick, about the way Lorraine looked right through me like I was furniture. I wrote about the fantasy of running away, of disappearing into a city that didn't care who my parents were. I had never been to New York, but I built it in my mind like a cathedral. Crowded, loud, anonymous. The kind of place where I could breathe without checking the emotional weather first. I imagined myself walking into NYU's journalism department, holding a bag of notebooks, wearing boots that didn't pinch. I saw myself reporting from the streets, asking questions, telling stories that mattered. Mine maybe, or someone else's. In that journal, I wrote like I was already free. At school, I stayed quiet. Most kids avoided me. My last name carried weight, and I never hung around long enough to show interest in anyone except Olivia Bennett. We met during gym class. She was new, a transfer from another state, and had the kind of confidence that made people think she didn't care what anyone thought. She asked if I wanted to be her volleyball partner. I said yes, though I hated volleyball. I was terrible, but she didn't seem to mind. 2 weeks later, she found me crying in the bathroom. I was careful, no sound, no sniffling, but the mascara gave me away. I had failed a geometry pop quiz. Another small failure that would cause a ripple at home. Olivia didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat beside me on the floor, back against the wall, and pulled a piece of gum from her bag. "You don't have to tell me," she said, chewing, "but I'm really bad at math too." I laughed before I could stop myself. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. But it was real. That was how it started. We weren't best friends. We didn't have sleepovers or matching bracelets, but sometimes she'd sit with me at lunch. Sometimes she'd walk with me to class. Once she handed me a used copy of a book called How to Start a Revolution and said, "Thought you'd like this." One afternoon, when the weather turned cold and the heaters at school kicked on too strong, we sat on the back steps near the theatre department. The sun hit just right. Olivia looked at me and asked, "Are you okay?" And for the first time, I didn't lie. "No," I said quietly. She didn't press, she just nodded, pulled her jacket tighter around herself and said, "Cool." Me neither. It was the first time I realized not being okay didn't make me broken, just human. Miss Carter was the kind of teacher who actually read your writing. Not just the grammar and sentence flow, but the space between the words, the intention, the things you didn't know you were saying, until she circled them in the margins. When she announced our assignment, write a fictional short story that explores a character's private reality versus public appearance. I felt like someone had read my mind. That was my entire life. It poured out of me like ink had been waiting for permission. I didn't write about myself directly. I changed the names, the setting, the details. The girl in my story was named Liar. Her parents were wealthy hotel owners in Miami. Her bruises were from accidents. Her silence was called obedience, but the pain, that was all mine. I submitted it on a Monday and spent the next few days pretending I hadn't cracked myself open on the page and handed it over to someone who smiled too gently to be trusted. On Friday, Miss Carter asked me to stay after class. "I read your story," she said, closing the classroom door. It was extraordinary, raw, honest. I swallowed hard, but also troubling. She pulled out my paper, now marked with comments, but she didn't hand it to me. Instead, she sat across from me and lowered her voice. "Emily, I know it's fiction, but if there's anything in that story that's even a little bit real, I want you to know you don't have to go through it alone." My mouth opened, then closed. She continued, "I have a friend, Sarah Jenkins. She's a lawyer, specializes in helping teens in difficult family situations confidentially. She could. No, I said quickly. Miss Carter blinked. I haven't even given you her number yet. I can't, I whispered. It's just a story, really. She didn't press. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly and said, I believe you, but if you ever change your mind, I'll be here. I thanked her, left the room, walked into the hallway with the paper in hand, feeling like I was holding something radioactive. That night I read her notes. Things like haunting imagery and powerful symbolism were scrolled in the margins, but one sentence stood out, written in purple ink near the end. This story doesn't have to stay fiction. I stared at it for a long time, and then I ripped the paper in half. Then in quarters, then again until it was nothing but confetti. I flushed the pieces down the toilet like they were evidence because deep down, some part of me still believed I was the problem, that I had exaggerated, that I'd made them look bad, that I was being dramatic, that love looked different for different families, and mine just happened to be sharp-edged. I wasn't ready to risk their wrath to chase something I wasn't even sure I deserved help. That night, I wrote in my hidden journal, maybe Miss Carter is right. Maybe I could tell someone. But what if I do and I'm wrong? What if the story I've lived isn't the story people believe? What if no one ever sees Leia as real? What if they only see a girl who betrayed her family? I put the journal back in its hiding place, sealed the floorboard, and slept with my palms clenched tight against my chest. Even when someone reached for me, I couldn't take the hand because I still thought falling was safer than flying. I applied to NYU the same way I did everything else that mattered to me, quietly, in secret, and with shaking hands. The library computers were old and slow, but they worked. I stayed late under the pretense of extra credit, typing each essay with heartbeats in my throat. I printed out my transcript, scanned recommendation letters from Mrs.
Carter and the guidance counselor, and mailed everything from the post office 3 blocks from school. I even paid the application fee with cash I had slowly hoarded from lunch, money I pretended I didn't need. I didn't tell Olivia. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't want to make it real. Not yet. It felt too sacred, too fragile, like saying it aloud would make it evaporate. The acceptance email came one afternoon when Lorraine was out and Charles was in court. I was sitting in the kitchen, laptop open, my finger hovering over the refresh button on my email inbox. When the words appeared, "We are pleased to offer you admission to NYU," I stopped breathing. I read it twice, then a third time, then printed the letter and hid it inside my diary under the floorboards. That night, I said nothing. I smiled at dinner. I complimented Lorraine's chicken picarda. I laughed at a story my father told about a judge falling asleep during closing arguments. I felt the email burning in my chest like a second heartbeat. 3 days later, it all came undone. Charles found the letter. I don't know how. Maybe he was snooping, maybe Lorraine tipped him off, or maybe somehow he just knew I had dared to want something without his approval. I was in my room when he walked in, holding the printed email like a warrant. "Is this a joke?" he asked. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. "New York," his voice dropped. "Journalism." "I got in," I whispered. That was the wrong answer. The blow landed before I saw it coming. A backhand across my mouth that split my lip open instantly. Blood filled my mouth, metallic and warm. I stumbled backward into the desk, but he was already on me again. "You sneaky little bitch," he hissed. "Behind my back after everything I've done." He shoved me hard. I hit the bookshelf, books clattering to the floor. Another blow, this time to my side. Something cracked. The pain was white-hot and immediate. I gasped, but no sound came. "I decide your future," he growled. Not some pathetic dream cooked up between classes. The room tilted. The floor hit me harder than he did. I don't remember blacking out, just sudden silence, sudden cold. I was on the floor, curled in on myself, and the only thing I could think was, I'm going to die and he'll call it an accident. But he didn't. He walked out, and Lorraine walked in. She didn't scream. She didn't kneel. She didn't cry. She picked up the printed email from the floor, looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone. "I need to speak with the admissions office," she said calmly. "Yes, regarding an application under the name Emily Carter. There's been a mistake." Her voice faded. My vision blurred. The last thing I saw before the pain took me under was my mother standing over me like a funeral director, handling logistics, not grief. When I came to, everything hurt. My side throbbed with each breath, and the taste of dried blood lingered on my tongue. The room was dim. Someone had drawn the curtains, but daylight still filtered in. The clock on my nightstand blinked, 3:12 p.m. I had been unconscious for almost a full day. I tried to sit up and nearly passed out again. There were no ice packs, no pain meds, just silence. And the faint sound of Lorraine's heels clicking through the hallway like nothing had happened. I reached under my mattress, fingertips fumbling for the floorboard. The diary was still there, untouched. So was the printed NYU acceptance letter, but on top of it, folded neatly, was a second paper, an email confirmation. Withdrawal request confirmed, application canceled. The sender, NYU admissions. The recipient, my email address. Only I hadn't sent it. I stared at it for minutes, heart pounding, jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. The subject line might as well have said dream revoked. I didn't need to ask who had done it. Lorraine was methodical, clean, efficient, just like the way she arranged flower V's and wiped fingerprints off silverware. No mess, no hesitation. I wanted to scream, wanted to rip the curtains down and smash the mirror. But instead, I lay there and shook. That evening, she brought me soup, chicken broth, in a porcelain bowl, perfectly warm. She didn't say a word. She didn't ask how I felt. She just placed it on the nightstand and turned to leave. I couldn't help myself. "Why?" I croaked, voice roar from blood and shame. She paused at the doorway. "You would have ruined everything," she said without turning around. That was it. That night, I made a decision. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the same one I'd looked into every day of my life, the same mirror that had reflected the girl they had trained me to be. Clean, polite, composed. The girl who wore lipstick over bruises and smiled through speeches she didn't write. I opened the drawer and pulled out the electric razor my father used to trim his beard. Then I picked up a pair of scissors. It took 5 minutes. Long chunks of brown hair fell to the sink like feathers from a torn-down angel. By the time I turned on the razor, my hands were steady. The buzzing filled the bathroom louder than my heartbeat. I didn't cry. When I was done, I looked like someone I didn't recognize. And for the first time in years, I liked what I saw. This girl wasn't beautiful. She was raw, stripped, unmade. She didn't belong in a gala dress or a family portrait. She belonged to herself. There were no cameras, no applause, no one to tell me I looked radiant. And that was the point because I wasn't doing it for them anymore. That night I wrote in my journal, "They think they erased my future, but all they did was force me to carve a new one with my own hands. I may be broken, but now I'm sharp too." After I shaved my head, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't rage. It was calculation. I started documenting everything. Each bruise, each cut, each red mark that bloomed under my skin like silent confessions. I used an old digital camera from the storage room, hidden in a shoebox beneath my bed. Each photo was time-stamped, labeled, and backed up onto a password-protected flash drive I wore as a necklace beneath my shirt. Just a charm to anyone else. To me, evidence I recorded audio too. I bought a tiny voice recorder from a porn shop. 3 neighborhoods away, using change I scraped together over weeks. I tucked it in the lining of my backpack in the corner of my dresser beneath couch cushions. I learned how to be silent when I needed to, and how to let others talk themselves into exposure. Some of the recordings made my hands shake. My father's voice low and venomous. "One more stunt, Emily, and I'll do worse than your jaw." Lorraine slurred over wine. Maybe if you weren't so dramatic, he wouldn't get so angry. Every time I replayed them, I remembered this wasn't my fault. It never had been. Miss Carter noticed the difference. She didn't ask questions, but she did quietly hand me a piece of paper with a name and number scribbled across it. Sarah Jenkins, family law, Domestic support. Tell her you're the one I mentioned, she whispered. She'll know. The next day, I used the school library to email Sarah. She responded within hours. We met at a small bakery across town, far enough from my neighborhood to be safe. She looked like someone who had survived something herself. Sharp eyes, tired smile, strong posture. She didn't pity me. She just listened. When I showed her the photos and played the recording, she leaned back slowly. This is strong, she said. But we'll need more patterns, timelines, enough to make it impossible to dismiss. Are you ready for that? I nodded. I don't have a choice. She gave me a burner phone, taught me how to clear browsing history, how to encrypt files, how to disappear if I ever had to. You're doing this for yourself, she said, but also for whoever comes next. I left that meeting feeling like I had armor. That night, I placed the recorder under the sofa cushion before dinner. Charles was in a good mood, which meant Lorraine was radiant. I passed the potatoes, smiled when prompted, played the part. After dinner, while clearing the table, I realized something was off. My recorder was gone. I panicked. My hands shook so badly I dropped a fork. I checked under the cushion behind the couch in the side drawer. Nothing. I spent the rest of the night curled in bed, heart pounding, waiting for the confrontation. It never came. The next morning, I found the recorder neatly placed back in my dresser. I checked the file. It had recorded the entire dinner up to the point where Charles started mocking the idea of kids these days thinking they know trauma. It hadn't been deleted. It hadn't been touched. And when I looked at the device, I saw something strange. A smudge of red lipstick. Lorraine had found it, and she had returned it. No words, no apology, just quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't redemption, but it was the first crack in the mask. It had been almost 3 weeks since my first meeting with Sarah Jenkins. I continued collecting evidence, photos, recordings, journal entries. Every night I added more pieces to the puzzle I planned to expose. But I still felt like I was playing defense, waiting for the next blow, the next insult, the next small tear in my already thin armor. Then Sarah emailed me with the subject line, "Something you need to see." We met again in the same bakery. She ordered tea this time. I didn't touch mine. "I've been digging into your father," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "He's good at hiding things, but not good enough." Inside were photos, receipts, emails, a hotel bill from a boutique inn in Midtown charged under a fake name but billed to one of Charles's corporate cards. An internal email chain from a rival law firm. A screenshot of social media that showed a woman, early 30s, sleek.
Dark hair, the kind of face that belonged on luxury print ads, standing beside Charles at a charity gala last spring. She's an associate at Braxton, and how Sarah said he's been seeing her for at least 6 months, maybe longer. My stomach dropped. That's not surprising, I murmured. But it doesn't explain. It does, she interrupted gently. Abusers don't just explode. They escalate when they feel cornered. Your father's perfect world is cracking, his reputation slipping, his career's threatened. He's using you to bleed pressure. She leaned in. This was never about your grades, Emily, or your silence or your dreams. It's about his control. And when he starts losing it in one place, he tightens the leash somewhere else. My chest felt hollow. All this time I thought I was the trigger, the failure, the weak link. But I wasn't even the point. I was just the surface he cracked when the foundation underneath started to rot. "I thought he hated me," I whispered. "I thought I made him like this." Sarah shook her head. "You didn't make him anything. He was always like this. You were just close enough to take the hits." I stared at the folder, the glossy image of betrayal and falseness. It was a strange kind of clarity. I had spent years trying to decode his moods, to avoid setting him off, to be good enough to avoid the storm. But now I saw the truth. I had never been the storm's cause, just its most convenient target. That night I went home in a trance. I walked past Lorraine in the kitchen. She was stirring tea, her eyes shadowed. Our gazes met briefly, neither of us spoke. I went to my room and opened my journal. He didn't hit me because I was loud or rebellious or weak. He hit me because he couldn't hit the real source of his fear. His reputation crumbling, his secret leaking, his mask slipping. And I was right there, small, quiet, close. I flipped the page and wrote again. This wasn't personal, that's what makes it worse. Because some part of me, as twisted as it sounds, had wanted it to be personal. I wanted his anger to mean something. If it was about me, at least I mattered in his world. But I didn't. I was a pressure valve, a wall he punched when the ceiling cracked. Sarah's revelation didn't erase the pain, but it changed the shape of it. I stopped feeling guilty, and I started feeling dangerous, because now I wasn't just surviving abuse, I was exposing strategy. And the more I watched him, the more I saw it. The phone calls he took outside, the business trips that were suddenly last minute, the way Lorraine poured more wine and said less. She knew, of course she did, maybe she always had. But instead of confronting it, she redirected her pain onto me because it was easier to blame the child than admit she'd built her life on a sinking foundation. The silence wasn't just a lack of courage. It was a shared agreement. Keep the mask on or lose everything. Only now I had no interest in pretending. The storm was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was it. The morning of Charles Carter's 52nd birthday was unseasonably perfect. Sunlight streamed through every window, casting long golden beams across the polished marble floors. The house smelled like roses and roasted duck. Lorraine directed the catering staff like a conductor, ensuring every glass gleamed and every centerpiece matched the napkins. I moved like a ghost through the halls, unnoticed, but perfectly groomed. Lorraine had picked out my dress, a soft lavender sheath, delicate and demure. She curled my hair herself, her fingers brushing my scalp with robotic tenderness. "Smile tonight," she said. "No tension, no games." I didn't answer. The flash drive was hidden in the lining of my clutch. Inside it were weeks of documentation, photos, audio recordings, digital copies of my diary entries, and one specific video I had edited together the night before. By 7 p.m, guests began arriving. The driveway filled with black cars and laughter. Men in suits and women in diamonds walked through our foyer with practiced ease. They greeted Charles with admiration, toasted him before dinner even started, called him a role model, a mentor, a man of unshakable principles. I watched it all unfold from the shadows. And then dessert was served. The room dimmed slightly as the staff rolled in a massive cake, 3 tiers, white and gold, with the words, "To the man who built it all." Everyone clapped, cameras flashed. Charles gave a short, smug speech about gratitude and hard work. When he sat back down, I stood up. "Before the night ends," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I'd like to give my own gift." All eyes turned to me. Charles blinked in surprise. Lorraine's wineglass froze mid-air. I walked to the media console and plugged in the flash drive. The screen behind the table flickered to life. The first image, my face, swollen, bruised, my lips split. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Click, next slide. Another angle. The fading bruise on my jaw. The caption read, 3 days after my NYU acceptance. Click. The audio started, my father's voice sharp and cold. "I'll break more than your jaw if you ever disobey me again." Click. A video clip. My mother sipping wine while I winced in the background. Her voice. She's always been difficult. Maybe she needs to be reminded who runs this house. People weren't breathing. Charles shot up, face flushed. "Emily, what the hell do you think? Sit down," I said. And then came the final twist. The doorbell rang. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, calm and unreadable. We received a report regarding domestic abuse and endangerment. One said, "May we speak with the residents?" The room fractured. Gasps turned into whispers, whispers into accusations. Charles lunged forward, wild-eyed, reaching for the remote to turn off the screen. But Officer Reyes stepped between us. "Please, sir, we need you to remain seated." And for the first time in my life, he obeyed. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. The officers separated guests and family into different rooms. Some guests left quickly, murmuring excuses and averting their eyes. Others lingered, stunned and silent. Lorraine sat on the living room couch, legs crossed, hands folded like she was at afternoon tea. When questioned, she waved everything off. "She's emotional," she told them. "She's been troubled for years. We've done our best." I stood nearby, hands still and still, face calm. The officers turned to Charles, who tried to assert his legal authority, dropping names and demanding calls be made. They remained unimpressed. Then Officer Reyes asked, "Mum, have you ever witnessed physical abuse towards your daughter?" Lorraine smiled thinly. "Of course not. We discipline her." "Yes, but that's called parenting. She's dramatizing everything." My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it, that no matter how much truth I showed, no one would believe me. And then Lorraine looked at me, really looked. Something flickered in her expression. Not guilt, not regret, recognition. She looked back at Officer Reyes. Then, quietly, she said, "He did hit her." Silence. "I didn't stop it," she added, voice cracking. "I watched it happen. I told myself it was discipline, that it was stress, that she was difficult, but it wasn't. I knew what it was." The officer froze, pen in midair, tears welled in Lorraine's eyes. She begged me with her eyes every time, and I said nothing. The words shattered the room, a confession raw and public. "I helped him destroy her," she whispered, clutching her necklace like it could hold her together. "And I'm sorry. I don't know if it means anything, but I am." It was the moment the audience, those still present, should have felt catharsis, but instead something else crept in. Doubt. Was it real or rehearsed? Did Lorraine mean it? Or was this just another pivot, another mask? I didn't answer her. I didn't cry. I just turned away because forgiveness was another performance I wasn't ready to give. After Lorraine's public confession, the room emptied quickly. The guests who stayed wore expressions like they'd witnessed a crime scene, not a celebration. No one touched the cake. No one looked anyone in the eye. Some mumbled awkward words, sympathy, confusion, excuses, and slipped away into the night. Charles was taken out in handcuffs just before midnight. The sight should have brought satisfaction, relief, even triumph. Instead, all I felt was hollow. He didn't fight, he didn't shout, he didn't even glance back. He just walked stiffly past the remnants of his perfect life, like it was debris from someone else's disaster. When the front door closed behind the officers, silence wrapped the house like plastic. Lorraine sat at the edge of the sofa, still clutching her necklace. Her tears had dried, but the stain they left remained. "Emily," she said softly, "please." I didn't answer. "Please," she said again, standing up. I walked past her, up the stairs, down the hall, into the room that had once belonged to my parents, but now felt like a sealed vault of denial. I knew the passcode to the safe. It was my birthday. Ironic considering how little that date had ever meant to either of them. The safe clicked open. Inside, under a few folders and financial documents, was a red velvet box. I pulled it out and opened the lid. Photographs, old ones. Me as a toddler in overalls, me in a Halloween costume, me on the beach at Tybee Island. Only most of them were burned. Edges singed, some faces blackened. One picture was half gone, my smile erased, the rest of the frame intact. The photo smelled faintly of smoke and perfume, Lorraine's perfume. I stared down at the warped collection of memories and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not even betrayal, clarity. She hadn't just watched him. Hurt me. She hadn't just covered for him. She'd actively tried to erase me bit by bit from the albums, from the house, from the narrative. This wasn't a mother broken by circumstance. This was a woman who had chosen silence, chosen compliance, chosen comfort. And then, when it was no longer sustainable, she chose performance. The apology downstairs hadn't been for me. It had been for them, the audience, the legacy, the reputation still salvageable through public penance. I placed the box back in the safe, closed the door, and turned the lock. Then I returned to the hallway where Lorraine stood at the top of the stairs, eyes rimmed red. "I didn't know you found those," she whispered. I didn't respond. I didn't mean I raised her hand. She stopped. "I'm not here for explanations," I said. "I'm not here for forgiveness." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "I'm just here to finish packing." I brushed past her. There was nothing left to say. Downstairs, the house remained frozen in celebration. Balloons still swaying, half-empty glasses on the table, music still faintly playing from a speaker no one remembered to turn off. But the illusion had cracked beyond repair. The Carters weren't a family. They were a story, a fiction, a beautifully constructed lie. And I wasn't going to be its main character anymore. That night, I packed a bag, not just with clothes, but with everything that mattered. The shell from the beach, my journal, the flash drive, the burner phone Sarah had given me. I didn't leave a note. I didn't look back because I didn't need to explain myself anymore. They had erased me once. This time I was erasing them. 1 year later, the view from my window didn't overlook white fences or manicured lawns. It faced a brick wall splashed with graffiti and crowned with barbed wire. Beneath it, an alley where someone's dog barked every morning at 6:45 a.m. My tiny studio in Brooklyn was barely more than a box with a stove. But it was mine. Every inch of it was mine. The first thing I hung on the wall was the scallop shell from Tybee Island. Faded, chipped, but still whole. Next to it, I taped a photo I'd taken of myself with a disposable camera from the NYU welcome picnic. Short hair, no makeup, smiling for real. Freedom had a smell. It wasn't flowers or money. It was cheap coffee, dusty library shelves, ink on your fingers after typing until 3 o'clock a.m. My first published piece appeared in the university paper that October, a column called "When the Fire is Invisible, Recognizing Gaslighting in the Family Home." It didn't mention names. It didn't have to. It detailed the patterns, the denial, the rewriting of memory, the manipulation of emotions until you questioned your own reality. I wrote it with clinical precision and emotional fire. My professor said it was incendiary without being vindictive. By the end of the week, 3 students emailed me privately. One said, "Your story sounds like mine." Another wrote, "I didn't even know what gaslighting was until now. I thought I was just losing my mind." That was the moment I realized healing wasn't just about recovery. It was about translation, turning pain into something that speaks. Ethan helped me remember how to listen. We met in a creative writing class. He was the quiet guy who took candid photos of strangers on the subway and always smelled faintly of wood and cinnamon. He didn't talk much at first. He just showed up. He asked before touching, not just physically, emotionally, too. "Do you want to talk about it?" he'd ask. And if I shook my head, he didn't press. The first time I told him about my parents, I expected the usual reaction: pity, horror, disbelief. Instead, he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that and nothing else. No rescuing, no fixing, just space." It felt like learning to walk again, but on ground that finally didn't shift beneath me. Olivia came to visit in December. She'd stayed in Boston for college, closer to her family. But we talked every week, texts, voice notes, even mailed letters when we felt nostalgic. When I opened the door and saw her on my snowy doorstep with 2 cups of hot chocolate and a crooked smile, I cried before I could even say hello. "You have better lighting than I expected," she said, stepping into my tiny apartment like it was the Taj Mahal. We sat on the floor and talked for hours about everything, about nothing. She looked at the scallop shell, still taped above my desk. "You kept it," she whispered. "I had to," I said. "It reminds me that even the fake moments had real pieces." We didn't talk about Charles or Lorraine. We didn't need to. We'd lived in the echoes long enough. Now we were learning the language of silence that heals, not wounds. Before she left, Olivia reached into her bag and handed me something. It was a copy of the student newspaper folded to my column. "I saved this," she said. "It made me feel seen." I hugged her tightly. Sometimes the people who saw you at your worst are the ones who help you find your best. That night, I lay in bed listening to the city hum outside my window. I was far from healed. There were still nights I woke up sweating, still days when the mirror reflected too many ghosts, but I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't afraid to speak, and I wasn't alone. In a notebook beside my bed, I wrote, "Healing isn't a straight line. It's a loop, a spiral, a dance with old shadows and new light. But each step forward counts, even the small ones, especially those." Tomorrow, I would write another piece. Tomorrow, I would walk into class with short hair and a clear voice. Tomorrow, I would keep building. Because I was no longer surviving my story, I was writing it. The auditorium wasn't full, but it didn't need to be. The people who were there, survivors, advocates, counsellors, made the space feel electric. It was the annual Northeast Coalition for Survivors conference, and I was the final speaker of the afternoon panel, reclaiming narrative after abuse. When Sarah first invited me to speak, I'd hesitated. "What would I even say?" I asked. She smiled. "The truth. That's more than enough." So here I was, standing behind a lectern, notes in hand, heart steady for once. My voice had trembled in practice. It didn't now. "I used to think I was broken," I began. "Not because someone told me, but because I lived in a house where silence was louder than screams, and smiles were weapons sharper than fists." A few heads nodded, some wiped tears. I didn't know I was being gaslit. I just knew I felt wrong all the time. Like my thoughts had edges, and I was always cutting myself on them. I talked about the photos, the recordings, the day the truth unspooled in front of a room full of people who only knew my father's polished persona. But the real reclamation didn't start when he was arrested, I said. It started the night I looked in the mirror with no hair and no performance, and didn't look away. I paused before the final line of my speech, heart pounding harder than I expected. I'm not here because I healed. I'm here because I'm healing. And there's room for all of us in that process. The applause was thunderous, genuine. After the session, people came up one by one to thank me, to tell me I gave voice to their own unspoken stories. Then a woman in her 40s approached. She looked kind, tired, but strong. "May I ask you something personal?" she said. I nodded. "Have you forgiven your mother?" The room seemed to hush again just for that question. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. Then I said, "No." She blinked. "But I've forgiven myself for believing I ever deserved less than love, for thinking I had to earn safety, for waiting for an apology to start healing. That's the forgiveness that changed everything." The woman nodded, eyes glassy. "That's brave." I shook my head. "It's survival." That night I sat in my apartment with the city pulsing outside and my laptop glowing before me. I opened a blank document. The title came to me instantly. "You are never too broken to begin again." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a diary entry. It was a declaration, a roadmap, a hand reaching back into the dark for whoever might still be there. I wrote for hours about shame, about illusion, about how silence can feel like home when it's all you've ever known. I wrote about how healing is clumsy and non-linear, and how we don't need to be perfect to deserve peace. I ended the piece with this: forgiveness is not a ticket to reunion. It's not a reward for someone else's apology. It's a doorway we open for ourselves to walk through and out into the light, finally unburdened by ghosts we never asked to carry. The next morning, I submitted the article to an online journal focused on trauma recovery. I didn't think much of it, but by noon, it had been shared over 1,000 times. By evening, 100,000. By the end of the week, over 500,000. My inbox overflowed with messages, readers telling me they'd printed the article and taped it to their mirrors, that it gave them permission to leave, to start therapy, to breathe again. One email simply said, "You gave me language, thank you." An editor from a major media outlet called and asked if I would do an interview, then a podcast, then a panel. Somewhere between the heartbreak and the healing, I had become something I never expected. A voice people listened to. The shell was still on my wall. The bruises were long gone, but the memories remained like old scars that no longer hurt, but still remind you where you've been. And yet I no longer whispered when I wrote, I declared, because I had found the truth. Not in the courtroom, not in the arrest, but in the act of speaking, when I was told to stay silent. And the first time someone asked me, how did you get out? I didn't say luck or courage. I said one sentence at a go.